Good morning. This is not my first time in this space. I've had a couple of occasions when I've worshiped with you before, so I've seen Pastor Vicki here in this pulpit. And I would like to report to those in charge of buildings and grounds that the pulpit seems to be growing. It's a joy to be with you today. Whoosh. Fire leaped out of the place where the palm branches were burning and plumed upwards quickly. The children gathered round looking and seeing the palms burn. Their eyes were wide open, fascinated, and then each one by one, would take a palm branch, lay it in the fire, and then once again, whoosh. The branches were so dry, and the leaves were paper thin, that they burned so quickly and brightly. It was Ash Wednesday. Wednesday was the day when the congregation I served had special activities at the church, and so each year, Wednesday activities included Ash Wednesday, and each year we took the palm branches from the prior year's Palm Sunday and burned them to make ashes. They had been hidden away out of sight in a garbage bag in my office, in the closet. The children seemed particularly eager to be a part of all this. It is not every congregation that allows or actually encourages children to play with fire. In that congregation, fairly non-liturgical in nature, Ash Wednesday was designed for the children, oddly enough. So the service began with all the children sitting on the floor before me. We would pray and sing. We would talk about some important things. Has anyone in the past year known a friend or a family member or a pet who has died? After our conversation, as many as wanted would have ashes placed on their foreheads. We thanked God for those who had passed and acknowledged that all things die. All that comes from God returns to God. It is interesting to note that the parents, who generally were sitting on chairs behind the children, keeping watch over the flocks by night, would shift in their chairs during this time, seeming a bit uncomfortable, while the children sat on the floor very still. I like to think that those Ash Wednesday services had some small effect on the children of that congregation. I suspect that it did because over the years, I was called upon to perform a number of pet funerals for the children of the church. The children learned that sometimes when we are sad, we need to begin with goodbye. After a couple years of this, a parent came to me and said, I'm concerned about my daughter. Ash Wednesday is such a downer. I worry that talking about death with children might frighten them. I resisted the temptation to explain that it seemed to frighten the adults more. So I tried to reassure the mother that talking with and listening to children who actually had lost someone dear to them was better than silence on the subject. For many in our society, sorrow and sadness are to be ignored or denied. In 2020, during the presidential primaries, then candidate in the primary, Joe Biden's campaign, released a TV ad. They released it only in Iowa. It was not a long ad, and its purpose was not to provide a lecture or a speech or present a platform. Instead, there was a series of pictures, of photographs. First, of a younger Joe Biden grieving the deaths of his wife and daughter from an automobile accident. Then more pictures of him standing by the beds of his two sons who also were injured in the accident. Later, there was a photo of Joe Biden with his adult son, Beau, not long before that son died of brain cancer. The news commentators agreed this was a highly effective ad. Why? Because, they commented, everyone knows what it is to experience loss. Everyone. No exceptions. Jeremiah was not really expecting an answer. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? It's really two rhetorical questions. The answer is hidden in some way. It's embedded in the question itself. For the prophet, there was at that point no balm, no physician, because grief cannot simply be fixed or made to disappear, not even by God. The Babylonians first conquered Jerusalem around 597 before the Common Era. They carted off the best and the brightest into exile. Sometime shortly after this, Jeremiah spoke or wrote these words that we have in the 8th chapter. It is difficult to read those words or to hear them, as Dick read them earlier. It is difficult to comprehend those words without being moved, or at least affected. Why? Because everyone knows what it is to experience loss. Grief sometimes gives rise to questions. Questions like, why did the treatment that worked so well for others not work for my wife? Why did our pastor leave us? Why isn't our church more like the one in which I grew up? Why are beliefs that I depended upon and were once so reliable being questioned or seeming obsolete? How come I was not better prepared for the sorrow and grief that has come into my life? Is there no balm in Gilead? No physician there? Those kinds of questions really don't have answers. Answers would not be very satisfying anyway. Even though we are 2,500 years removed from Jeremiah, we can read Jeremiah's anguish. The prophet grieved for his people and his country, and I think he also suffered because the foundation of his faith had been shaken. Before Babylon conquered Judah, the faith of Jeremiah's forebears had been sufficient. What they believed about divine providence was enough to get them through the bumpy parts of life. Be faithful. Obey the commandments. Practice hospitality. Promote justice. Live in peace. Don't worry. God will reward you. And if misfortune does come your way, well, God must be chastening you, correcting, punishing. It is for your own good. God's punishment is intended to both fit and fix the crime. If something bad happens to you, one may assume that you simply deserve it. You know that everything happens for a reason, doesn't it? So it is obvious. You need to be fixed, straightened out. Was not this what happened to your northern neighbors, to Israel? They lost their way. They chased after other gods. They sold out the many poor so that a few could live in luxury. And then God punished Israel. They got what they deserved. The people of the northern kingdom suffered for their sins. Their legacy of shame continued even to Jesus' day, when the neighbors to the north were known as Samaritans. Judah believed that things would be different for them. They believed that God would destroy the Babylonians rather than allow them to conquer Judah. Jeremiah had warned them about Babylon, but the people and their rulers had ears only for the promise of a bright future. Jeremiah's warnings fell on deaf ears. When the first wave of destruction came in the year 597, even Jeremiah himself was unprepared. What he thought of as God's wrath was beyond the pale. Too much destruction, too much death, too much sorrow. Everything was out of balance. Even with Judah's shortcomings, their complete destruction was simply not fair. And of course, God is always fair, right? Psalm 97, which is paired in the lectionary with the Jeremiah text, prays this: "Pour out your wrath on the heathen who have not known you." This prayer asks God to be our counterpuncher. The psalmist believed that Judah enjoyed the special favor of God while their enemies did not. What happened was not fair. Worse than that, what they had long believed about God no longer worked. About 35 years ago, my wife and I attended a Peter, Paul, and Mary concert in Dayton, Ohio. Becca stayed home taking care of the younger children, so the adults could celebrate 4 birthdays, each birthday taking place in March. When it came time for Noel Paul Stuckey to do his solo bit, he struggled to get his guitar tuned. In exasperation, he said, "If I ever get this in tune, I'm going to weld it." Have you ever felt like that about your faith? If ever I get all the right beliefs, if ever I know enough, if that happens, I'm going to weld it in place so it never has to change. I never have to worry again. In the face of Judah's destruction, what they had believed about God no longer worked. They had to say goodbye to what everyone thought they knew was the truth about the divine. That is difficult. For some, impossible. How difficult it is to say goodbye to people we have loved and depended upon, and to beliefs we have trusted. How difficult it is to say goodbye to understandings that heretofore have defined us, and to loved ones who once gave our lives meaning and purpose. Whenever we lose someone or something precious, we begin with goodbye. That is why grieving is so difficult. Jeremiah said, "My heart is sick." You know what that's like as well, I suspect. There are no exceptions. During bouts with heart sickness, we often look for glimmers of hope to get us through the tough times. We often find that if hope comes, it takes time, perhaps a long time. Heart sickness requires something more than hope, or at least prior to hope. A heart that is sick or broken requires not so much hope as courage. It takes courage to face sorrow. Whatever the source of our grief may be. Grief is a daily walk, a process where we say goodbye over and over again. The English word courage is rooted in the French word for heart, cœur. To have courage is to take heart. Without courage, it is almost impossible to face our goodbyes squarely. Any faith that will not from time to time affirm the challenges of sorrow and grief is selling something. When we can be honest about our goodbyes, grief itself mysteriously brings a measure of comfort. St. Augustine knew this when he wrote, "The tears streamed down, and I let them flow freely as they would, making of them a pillow for my heart. On them it rested." Each of us needs or will need rest from heart sickness. Begin with goodbye. If we're fortunate, we will find the courage to move forward. Not exactly move on, not leave sorrow completely behind, but move ahead. There were those at the beginning of Judah's exile in Babylon who said, "Don't give up hope. Continue to be hopeful. Soon we will return. We'll rebuild the temple, and Jerusalem will be our home once again." You don't have to settle down. Soon God will raise you up and make a way to return to Jerusalem and Judah and the temple. We need not give up hope. We need not say goodbye. While Jeremiah was experiencing the deep sorrow born of his own farewells, he wrote a letter to the people in exile. It took him about 20 more chapters till he got to it. But in chapter 29, we find his counsel. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, to all the exiles in Babylon, build houses, live in them, plant gardens, and eat their produce. Take wives for your sons and husbands for your daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where you are in exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your own." Move ahead. Have you ever longed for the past? Does anyone here have an experience of wishing that the good old days would return? Of course, my opinion is that you're half right when you refer to the good old days. They were old. Have any of us idealized our past and wrapped some of our memories with a silver lining? In Brian McLaren's recent book, Faith After Doubt, he reminds his readers that faith, whatever form it takes, must not become nostalgia. We learn from the past. It is important in that way. But the church is not rooted in a longing for what used to be. Perhaps the United Church of Christ is trying to lead us all in that way when we say, God is still speaking. God does not, maybe God cannot, pluck us out of our sorrows. God cannot take our pain away. We cannot wish it away. We can't even pray it away. And we cannot avoid our sorrows by simply thinking of something else. So instead of intervening to make grief disappear, God takes another path. God shares our pain. God shares our grief. God does not protect us from difficult goodbyes, but bears our sorrows with us. God does not keep us from longing for what once was, but by sharing our humanity, God draws us in so that we might long for comfort from the Holy One. Large sorrows require large consolation. There is no greater comfort than the divine friend who shares both the heights of our joy and the depths of our sorrows. So, friends, begin with goodbye. Take heart. Be of good courage. Long for God. In a world of mixed blessings, that must be enough. And it is.